Mr. Bondi here with our next botany taxonomy lesson, this time on Polypodiophyta, or really ferns and all of their relatives. So we've got a lovely image of a fern plant here, and with a special indication around a singular frond, which is what we call the leaf structures of ferns. And it's key to take a note as we look at these fern plants. The things that really distinguish them away from their closely related cousins of mosses and all of the bryophytes is the introduction of vascular tissue, which we're going to see in a minute, which allows them to grow substantially larger than all of the bryophytes. So if I zoom in closer on one of those fronds, and this is actually the underside of a frond, I can notice first and foremost this vein that runs right down the middle. And this vein is the vascular tissue. This contains the materials necessary to move around water and then move around sugars and nutrients throughout the body of the plant so that those nutrients can get exactly where they need to go. This is the whole part of having a vascular system. Also seen on this picture too are all of these little circles that are found on the bottom side of the fronds. And these are called sorus individually, or sori plural. And really what they are is they're clusters of spores that are used in the reproductive portion for ferns and all of their relatives. These plants are vascular, but they still do use spores for their reproduction. They've not evolved yet into making seeds, which will come up in our next varieties of plants. Again, as we take a look a little more closely at vascular tissue, now this is not a fern here in this image over on the right. This is celery, but this is celery that's been soaked in water that has food coloring in it so that you can see the vascular tissue well. I'm sure we've all experienced, if you've eaten celery before, the stringy components inside of celery. That's vascular tissue. The first type of vascular tissue that we can see well in the celery is xylem. Xylem is responsible for water transport. And so in this image of the celery, the water had the dye inside of it, so the dye was picked up really well. So you can see the red and the green dye inside of the xylem tissue here. What's interesting to note is when all of this evolution of vascular tissue started, if we look down at this chart here at the bottom, we can see that mosses evolved around 450 million years ago, and then our ferns came into existence about 360. And so that's really when we start to see the introduction of vascular tissue into these plants, and then it started to increase the complexity, the size, and the quantity of these plants because they were able to effectively transport the materials where they needed to go. Really, one of the big things that allowed them to be taller and to store more materials so they could outcompete any of their bryophyte cousins. The other type of vascular tissue is called phloem, and phloem is responsible for moving around carbohydrates, or sugars, really the products of photosynthesis. Over here on the right, I have a cross-section of a stem. So imagine a stem of a non-woody plant. So like say, for example, a sunflower. And we've cut that plant in half, and now we're looking down into the stem. Now, it wouldn't be quite so visible as this, but you can see all of these structures over here within the stem. Specifically looking at this first area right here, this is where the phloem would be located. And there'd be several phloem clusters around the whole outside of this stem here. But that's the area where you'll find the movement of sugars and foods up and down throughout the stem of the plant. Now the phloem will carry these nutrients down from the leaves into the roots to be stored, but they can also move them back up from the roots, back into the leaves, or to the tips of stems for new growth and the addition of new leaves or new stems and that sort. The other thing that we can take note of too from this image are the xylem. The xylem are located interior to the phloem in almost every variety of stem, specifically in stems like this one, and their job is to move water. Now the difference here with xylem and phloem is the direction of flow. If you take a look over on this image over to the left, the xylem can only move water up against gravity. It's a one-directional flow, whereas phloem can move its contents, which is, mostly sugary water. It can move it both up and down, which is key for it sending nutrients exactly where they need to go. We take a look at the different variety of all of the Polypodiophyta. The first and most common one are the ones that we've been talking about the most already, which are ferns. Now, ferns, as I mentioned, are the most numerous, and they are by far the most diverse. There's well over 10,000 different species of fern. So when you go out into the, in a wooded area, this is the most common variety of this type of plant that you'll find are ferns. They're low growing. They prefer shaded areas with a decent amount of moisture. They do a really good job of surviving in these types of environments. Another type that falls into the Polypodiophyta are things called club mosses. Now the name is a little misleading by throwing the mosses in there. They are not mosses. Their bodies of them do look like that of a moss plant, though. They look like they're just really tall mosses. But because they have vascular tissue, they are not mosses. The club portion of the name comes from these little clubs that are at the end of their bodies, which are where their spores are made. So they make their spores in a different way than mosses do as well. So they're really not very similar to mosses other than that they look like them. So club mosses is a second variety in the Polypodiophyta group of organisms. The last is these horsetails. And the name is pretty apt in that they look somewhat similar to the tail of a horse. Now, these are unique in the fact that they have green stems, and then therefore they can do photosynthesis right within their stems. Another interesting feature about horsetails is that their stems are hollow, so they've been used throughout human history as an own natural straw, which is pretty interesting. The horsetails are fairly rare in their amounts of species. There are not very many species of these left alive. These are really an older version of the Polypodiophyta. And in fact, there were species of these around 250 million years ago that could grow up to 30 meters tall. That's over 90 feet tall. In fact, these would have been one of the dominant forms of plant life in early dinosaur times. So around 250 million years ago, we're looking at like the Triassic period, and during that time period, these would have been one of the major or the dominant forms of plants. There would not have been flowering plants at that point yet, or even conifers at that yet. So this would have been the main source of food for many herbivore dinosaurs at that time period. As I mentioned before, where we can find ferns and their relatives growing is primarily in shaded and in areas such as forest floors. It's like very common place to find them. The largest populations and the largest densities of ferns can be found in tropical rainforests, which is true of many varieties of plants. But there are the most variety of species and the highest populations in those areas. And that's because there's access to a lot of water, and because there's, well, a lot of sunlight, and a decent, and the temperature is good for their growing environments as well. You can also tend to find these ferns growing in places where flowering plants don't do well. So like in areas that are nutrient poor for their soil, or that there's really not a lot of soil to begin with, where flowering plants just wouldn't succeed well, and they don't need that. They don't have those same restrictions in terms of needing pollinators, so they can grow in some areas that flowering plants just tend to not do well. We look at the whole anatomy or the whole body of these plants. I mentioned the fronds to you earlier, and those are essentially the leaves. The rhizomes are these areas right here within the soil, and the rhizomes technically are then the stems, and the stems then grow beneath the soil. And then at the bottom you have the root-like structures, and the roots do the same thing as the roots in any other plant. They hold the plant in place, they absorb water and nutrients from the soil, and then send it up into the plant. You can see it slightly, and I have a better picture of it coming up later, but this right here, this structure that kind of looks like a curly portion, is called a fiddlehead. This is a young developing portion of the plant. Now, all of these fronds also are considered to be sporophytes, and more on sporophytes versus gametophytes coming up in a minute. Now, when we take a look at the life cycle, I'm going to start with looking at the spore production and release to start our life cycle. We look at first over here, in this case, spores are being released. The spores will then become a young gametophyte, which will then mature into a gametophyte. The gametophyte is unique in the fact that it's haploid. So we have this alternation of generations again, like we saw with our bryophytes or our mosses. This leafy gametophyte will only live long enough to produce egg and sperm. Those egg and sperm are released from the same gametophyte. And so in this situation right here, the egg and sperm are released from the gametophyte. They can join together to form a zygote. That zygote is a fertilized egg. That fertilized egg can then grow into a sporophyte. The sporophyte is then the green portion of the fern, or the frond portion of the fern. And so now here we have that sporophyte developing from the fertilized egg, the zygote, becoming that fern frond. Now this fern frond can then produce spores, which will then be released to start this process all over again. Here's a closer look at one of those gametophytes that I was mentioning. And again, this portion is only available to produce the egg and sperm. After fertilization has happened, it's very common for these gametophytes to break down and then no longer be needed, and they're removed from the plant. Here's an image of a fiddlehead. So this is the young sporophyte growing, and it uncurls to form the frond as it grows. And an interesting tidbit about fiddleheads is that they can actually be eaten. And so there are some common dishes that are made. I've been told that they taste a little bit like asparagus, although I've not yet tried them. And so that's it for our lesson on ferns. Coming up next, we'll look at gymnosperms or conifers in a little bit more detail.